4 hours. 4 hours. In 4 hours, you can watch the entire movie, The Godfather, and still have time to talk about whether Pacino or, what was the other guy? Brando provided a better performance. You could sit, I'm told, through the entire Super Bowl game, watching halftime and all of the commercials. You could drive from here to Washington, D.C., do a little circle around the mall, and then come back in 4 hours. Or you could plant yourself in a stadium somewhere and watch an entire NASCAR race. 4 hours, interestingly enough, is also the amount of time that it would take you to read every single word of Jesus recorded in all 4 of the Gospels. Not the narrative descriptions about what he did, just his red letter words. Scholars have counted them, and they have timed the reading, and the total comes out somewhere between 3 and 4 hours, depending on how fast you read out loud. For the most pivotal life in all of human history, that is a remarkably small archive of words. Now, I don't want to minimize what Jesus said. His words are staggering. The Sermon on the Mount alone could occupy a lifetime of reflection. And for some, it has literally occupied a lifetime of reflection. His parables continue to unsettle and surprise readers even 2,000 years later. When he said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," what he said cracked history wide open. None of his words were small words. But here is what John tells us at the very end of his gospel. After recording the resurrection appearances, after describing the moment Jesus breathed on his disciples and sent them out into the world, John pauses and says, "By the way, there's more. So much more. The things Jesus did were so numerous, so vast, that if they were all written down, John supposes that there would not be enough world to contain all of the books." And it raises a question worth sitting with, I think, this morning. What does it mean that the works of Jesus so completely outpaced his words? John 20:30, as we just heard, tells us something quite extraordinary. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. And then in chapter 21, verse 25, he goes on further. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose the whole world would not have room for these books. Think about what John is saying. We are talking about a ministry that lasted, roughly 3 years. Jesus walked primarily in a small region. He traveled on foot. He had no platform, no publishing house, no broadcast social media reach. And yet the scope of what he actually did was so enormous that John, the eyewitness who walked with him, found himself unable even to gesture at it fully. Scholars have debated whether this is hyperbole, a rhetorical exaggeration common in ancient writing, or whether John is pointing at something more literally true that the ripple effect of Jesus' actions were so far-reaching that the full accounting of them could never be completed. I think it's a little bit of both. John is using the language of impossibility to convey something that is actually impossible to convey. That Jesus was not primarily a teacher with a curriculum. He was a presence with a life. And lives, especially this one, cannot be fully documented ever. What we have in the Gospels is a curated selection. John tells us as much. He selected what he recorded for a specific purpose, that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. The Gospels are not biographies in our modern sense of the word. They are testimonies. They are invitations. And what they invite us to is not a system of teaching, but an encounter with a person whose actions were apparently without natural limit. Set the words of Jesus alongside the works of Jesus, and the imbalance is striking. Not just in quantity, though 4 hours of words against a world full of deeds is quite a gap. But the imbalance runs deeper than that. Consider what actually changed people in the gospel. The disciples did not follow Jesus because he gave a compelling lecture. They were called, often mid-task, and they went. The woman at the well in John 4 was transformed, yes, by a conversation. But the conversation was built around Jesus doing something that respectable rabbis of his day did not do. Sitting down at a Samaritan well and asking a woman for water. The action preceded the framed words. The 10 lepers were not changed by a sermon. They were changed because Jesus reached out towards the untouchable. Zacchaeus did not climb that tree to hear a theology. And when Jesus called him down and invited himself to dinner, Zacharias was transformed not by what Jesus said, but by what Jesus did. He showed up at the table of a man whom everyone else had written off. Even the crucifixion, the hinge point of history, was not primarily a speech. Jesus said 7 things from the cross. Each one was profound. The 7 last words, they are called. But what saved the world was not the statements. It was the act, the self-giving, the body broken, the blood poured out, and the resurrection, the event that John spends the bulk of his final chapters describing, was not a proclamation. It was an event. It happened. It was something that Jesus did, and it was the most world-altering action ever taken. N.T. Wright, one of the most respected New Testament scholars of our generation, argues in his landmark work, Jesus and the Victory of God, that studying the actions of Jesus, especially his symbolic actions, is a far better starting point for understanding him than studying isolated sayings, because actions cost more. They land differently and in our bodies and in our memories when we experience them. Wright is making a historical argument, but it carries theological weight. The deeds that Jesus was doing was something that his words alone could not. Miroslav Wolf, a theologian at Yale, who has spent decades thinking about how faith looks in real life and public practice, builds his life's work on a similar conviction. Jesus, Wolf insists, is not simply a moral teacher whose legacy is a collection of wise and demanding sayings. He is a living presence who calls his followers to active participation in the healing and the flourishing of the world. The message and the messenger are inseparable. The way Jesus moved through the world was itself the gospel. Now, this does run against the grain of much of how the church has operated for centuries. We have built institutions around the teachings of Jesus. We have organized denominations around doctrinal statements derived from his words. All of that definitely has its place, don't get me wrong. But somewhere in the institutionalization of Christianity, we may wrongly flipped the emphasis John was working so hard to establish here. John was not writing a theology textbook. He was bearing witness to a life lived. Come back to our text in John 20. It is the evening of the first day of the week. The disciples are locked in a room. They are afraid. They have heard the report from Mary Magdalene, but fear is more powerful than that, and it does not yield easily to her testimony. And then Jesus comes. He doesn't knock. He simply just appears and stands among them. And what does he do first? He shows them his hands and his side. Before any instruction, before any commission, he shows them the evidence of what he did. The wounds, the cost, the proof that this is not a ghost or a vision, but the same body that went into the tomb. And then he breathes. He breathes on them. That detail is not accidental. John is reaching all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, to the moment that God breathed into the nostrils of the first human being and the person became a living soul. Jesus does not explain this new creation. He enacts it. He breathes into them. The Holy Spirit is not a doctrine delivered into that room. It is a breath, a transfer, a physical act of impartation. And as part of the breath, there is a commission. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. But even that commission rests entirely on what he has already done. Died, risen, appeared, showed his wound, breathed his spirit. The words only make sense because of the actions that preceded them. This is the pattern John has been building towards all along. The Church of the Brethren has carried a simple identity for 3 centuries. We subscribe to no formal creed or set of rules. We simply try to do what Jesus did. Not say what Jesus said, do what Jesus did. That is an extraordinary thing to put at the center of a denomination's self-understanding. The Brethren tradition has always held that Jesus understood people's spiritual needs to include their day-to-day human ones, food, health, rest, comfort, friendship, unconditional acceptance. He showed his followers how to trust, how to care, and how to help. Steadily, lovingly, even radically, Jesus went out saving the world by serving its people. And the denominational tagline is not proclaiming the words of Jesus or teaching the doctrine of Jesus. It is continuing the work of Jesus peacefully, simply, together. Those three words are not decorative. They describe how the work gets done. Peacefully, because Jesus never coerced anyone. Simply, because he operated without institutional machinery or political leverage. And together, because he never sent anyone out alone. And notice, it is the work, the same limitless work John pointed to when he said the world could not hold the books. Some describe the brethren as more focused on orthopraxy than orthodoxy, right practice rather than right belief. You know, you can believe the correct things about Jesus and never do what Jesus did. You can recite every creed flawlessly and still walk past the person on the side of the road. You can have impeccable theology and a closed hand. But when Jesus stood in that locked room and breathed on his disciples, he was not handing them a curriculum. He was commissioning a continuation. John knew that what he was writing could not hold all of that, all that Jesus had done. And I think that admission is an invitation. It is an invitation to understand that the story of Jesus is not a closed archive. It is an ongoing account that we are living in today. Every act of mercy, every table opened to someone excluded, every wound tended, every person seen and known and loved, every wall crossed through, every human hunger fed. These are the chapters in a book the world has yet to contain. We are not here to be a community that talks about Jesus. The world has plenty of that. We are here to be a community that does what Jesus did, to breathe peace into frightened rooms, to show up at tables where we are not expected, to touch the things that other people avoid, to serve our way into the lives of our neighbors, to keep the account going. The words of Jesus were powerful, no doubt. But the works of Jesus, they changed the world. And those works, John tells us, are not finished. They are continuing in every congregation that takes seriously what it means to carry his name. They continue whenever we stop talking about love and start practicing. This is our calling, not to say the things that Jesus said, to do the things that Jesus did, peacefully, simply, and together. And now I too will stop talking.